Welcome to Seeing Eye to Eye, the show about innovation and integration. Why integration and innovation? Because we believe these are key skills for anyone on a path of continual progress, so you can create and successfully live a bold vision for a more meaningful future. We're your hosts. I'm Ash.
And I'm Joia. Join us for conversations that are part entrepreneurial strategy, part philosophical discussion, and part personal development tools. If you are or aspire to be a high performing and exponentially ambitious entrepreneur, thought leader, or creator, this show is for you. Ask me why.
4, 3, 2. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 3 of season 1, which is an exploration of the 21st Century Renaissance Human Project. That's a project that was introduced by Joia that we are going to be talking about throughout this season. And if you haven't heard episode 1 yet, go ahead and make sure you go back and listen to that to be introduced to that general project. And basically, the idea is that we want to talk about how to live a more well-rounded, fulfilling, meaningful life. And to do that, we're exploring these different aspects of a full human life that we think everybody should be on the path to developing over the course of their life. And so in today's episode, we want to focus on the aspect that we're calling being the athlete.
Yes.
So what is it to be an athlete? Why don't you go ahead and talk about that? Tell us what your definition of that is, Joia.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start even with the definition that I came up with here. So what is it to be an athlete in this broad sense that I think everybody can and ought to pursue? So it's pursuing physical fitness and health regimens for strength, endurance, adaptation, longevity, and vitality. So let's even take a moment and talk about why this matters. Break down some of these important goals here, like longevity, vitality, adaptability.
Okay, so yeah, you introduced those. You included those in your definition, and I think at least a couple of those are pretty self-explanatory. Why you want to pursue those as goals. So longevity, obviously, you want to live a longer life. Vitality, you want to live a better life. So this is the quantity and the quality of your life. Is there anything else about those that you want to focus on here for this aspect of being an athlete?
I think these are pretty straightforward, as you're saying. Everybody wants to live a longer life, but also a healthy life, one that we can actually pursue with enjoyment. So longevity, vitality, but adaptability is the more interesting one, the one that I don't think most people think about. And I think it's the one, though, that is most important to you and me, and particularly this show, because it's all about integration.
Yeah, it's a little bit more subtle, and it's kind of underlying those other two in a way. It's sort of how you live a longer and better life. And the way I kind of think about it, I have this amateur interest in evolutionary biology, and to me, it's really interesting to think about it in those terms. How when an organism is exposed to a selective pressure, there are basically two ways that it can respond positively to that. And one way is to become more adapted to that particular pressure in that particular environment. So in other words, is to become more specialized. Mm-hmm. But the other way is to generalize and to become more adaptable to a broader range of selective pressures and a broader range of situations and contexts, environments. And the same thing I think is true for an individual organism, in the course of their life. And obviously, like there's a maybe bigger short-term payoff to becoming more specialized and becoming more adapted to that particular situation that you find yourself in at the moment. Mm-hmm. But the long-term payoff of becoming more adaptable is much bigger. And I think that's kind of the strategy that you generally want to pursue to the extent possible in order to ultimately live a longer and fuller, more meaningful life, hopefully. Um,
Yeah, I love that. So let's just jump in. So when I think about physical fitness and health regimens, I think broadly we're talking about three different things. We're
mhm.
talking about nutrition, we're talking about movement, and we're talking about recovery. So, what I thought we could do is even just start to explore each of these. We could each maybe share some of our personal practices where each of us currently are at, thinking about nutrition, movement, and recovery. And I think some important ideas and principles are going to emerge even just from this discussion.
Yeah.
So let's start with nutrition. So why don't you start, Ash? Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you are with nutrition in your life right now?
Sure. Yeah. So to just give a little bit of background, I think I've maybe mentioned in previous episodes that I had this very long struggle with chronic illness,
Mm-hmm.
and as a result of that, as I began to recover, it was very important for me to really get nutrition right in order to make sure that my recovery was proceeding in a way that um, allowed me to get back on my feet because I was just totally gone for a while. But um, and prior to that, I ate pretty much just whatever. Like I didn't think a lot about nutrition, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had pretty good genetics in the sense that I could eat pretty much whatever I wanted and not like put on a lot of weight and things like that. So it just wasn't like a big concern for me until because of my health, for health reasons, I had to start paying more attention to it. And what eventually worked for me was actually initially I had to cut a lot of the sugar out of my diet, and this was something my doctor recommended as part of my treatment for the chronic Lyme disease. But and that helped somewhat. But what really made a huge difference for me was actually cutting the carbs down even more drastically and increasing fat and going on a ketogenic diet, which most people have probably heard of by now or a little bit familiar with. Um, and that's the ketogenic diet is maybe not for everybody. It's been studied for a lot of different health reasons and for weight loss and different things. And it has a lot of neurological benefits for people that have issues with that. So it was originally developed for people that had otherwise untreatable epilepsy and had really remarkable results with
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, and for me especially, like it really helped with my sleeping issues, which we're going to come to a little bit
Yep.
later when we talk about recovery. But anyway, yeah, so it just made just a huge dramatic difference for me really quickly. So for me, that was just very clear
Mm-hmm.
evidence that I couldn't ignore, that diet and nutrition played a really significant role in your health and the quality of your life and just how you feel and how you can function.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so that's just
So
kind of where I'm at right now. I still eat a generally ketogenic diet since I've recovered, pretty significantly from those health issues. I'm not as strict with it as I used to be, and I build in a little bit of variation at kind of different time scales. So I'll have like a cheat day once a week or so, or like a cheat meal anyway once a week, and up to like I'll have a cheat month once a year. I just take off the holidays, and I kind of eat whatever. But I still am more conscious about what I eat all the time,
mm-hmm.
um, which I think is helpful. But um, yeah, so I think you have a little bit different approach because you haven't had these kind of issues with chronic illness. So for you, it's more about kind of the enjoyment, maybe a little more. There's a saying about living to eat versus eating to live that you're maybe more on the opposite side of that from me.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess this gets back to these issues of longevity and vitality. And
Mhm.
so, I think, of course, like everybody, I want to live a long life. But to me, it's also important to prioritize a vital life. And part of a vital life to me is the enjoyment of life. And so, even just part of my background, so I'm partly Italian, and I always say it was my Italian grandfather who taught me how to eat. And I came from a family where food was such an important, not only an important ritual, but just an important way in which we found pleasure in day to day life. And that was how I grew up. I mean, I can tell you our family vacations, we literally would schedule and plan our vacations around which restaurants we
Oh,
wanted to
wow.
go to. And depending on which restaurant, that would determine the other activities that we would pursue.
Mm.
And now, even as an adult, I'm married to a fabulous husband who happens to be just an amazing chef. And that's definitely not a coincidence because
Mhm.
this passion for food is something we share. And we are definitely people who live to eat. I can't tell you how many hours we often put into certain meals that you eat in just an hour or so. You should see around Thanksgiving in our house, we literally start planning from the very beginning of November when we're starting to dry out pieces of bread so we can make the homemade stuffing and homemade dressing. And we have both stuffing and dressing for the turkey in our family. So the enjoyment of food, as I said, is very important to me. So a lot of times I am really looking for this integration between
Mm.
the longevity and the vitality.
Yeah.
So I am trying to pay attention to what it is about foods that make me feel good. I obviously want to be able to feel well and healthy throughout the day, to have a lot of energy, to feel that I can pursue and tackle all the things I want to handle during my day. But I also want to be able to enjoy myself as well. And so it's finding this integration. And so I always even like to point out there's a line that Julia Child famously, I think, borrowed from Oscar Wilde, where
Mhm.
she said, everything in moderation, including moderation. But I know you have
Mm.
a pushback even with that phrase. So maybe we
Yeah.
can go into that a little bit.
No, I like the spirit of that Oscar Wilde line, but the this idea of moderation and the way that it's often applied in this context of nutrition, I definitely have some issues with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I mean, like you, I mean, I do really enjoy food, and for a while I was definitely more on the eat to live side, but thankfully nowadays, even just a few years later, when I started doing the ketogenic diet, when hardly anybody had heard of it, there's a lot more options available now. Um, but it's still like a challenge to, I guess for me, it made me have to be really aware of specifically what I was eating and like really looking at the details, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this idea of moderation, just the way I see a lot of people use it is just as kind of like this vague way of sort of justifying whatever their existing eating practices are,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And because this concept of moderation is it's an inherently relative term, right? And so
Exactly.
there's really no way to know what is actually a moderate amount of something without kind of understanding what the healthy, the general healthy range would be, and then kind of trying to stay towards the middle of that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's generally no effort to do that. and
Mm-hmm.
and also it's just, even knowing what kind of the general healthy range for, kind of like a population would be doesn't necessarily mean that that would be kind of the healthiest approach for a particular individual in a particular context, right? Um,
Exactly. I totally hear what you're saying because I think you're right that the concept of moderation is just not quite right. It's getting at something important, which is
mhm.
about variety and it's about integration, but it doesn't actually give us a useful standard for figuring out what is an optimal way to integrate or an
Yeah,
optimal way to introduce variety into what it is that we do.
yeah. So I
And you're
think you
right. And
actually,
people just use it in a totally self justifying way. So,
right.
if I was the kind of person who ate, 3 meals of fast food every day and I'm down to just one fast food meal a day, hey, I'm eating
That's
moderately,
moderate, right? Exactly. But
but it's not
with this,
necessarily healthy.
for sure, exactly. But with this idea of variety, so I think you had a way of kind of introducing that idea at a very basic level when you would teach kids about kind of healthy living concepts and things.
Yeah, so part of my background is even as a yoga teacher, and I've taught kids yoga. And one of the delightful ways that we taught variety in eating to kids was this idea of eating a rainbow of your
Mm-hmm.
fruits and vegetables. So on the one hand, emphasizing that they should be eating fruits and vegetables, but that you shouldn't just even be eating the same vegetable or the same fruit, but that you should be getting a rainbow. You should be
Right.
having red fruits and vegetables, orange, yellow, green. The blue and purple is the hard one, but blueberries, eggplant, all of
Mm.
that.
Yeah, and I do think that's kind of moving in the right direction, and that's a good way of kind of introducing the basic idea of variety. But it's still a little bit vague, and it kind of works because with plant foods, the reason that a lot of those plants have these different colors is because of the different nutrients that they contain. So that's kind of like a good rough proxy for getting a range of these nutrients into your diet.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, you still want to be, a little bit more specific and detailed in terms of figuring out what it is that you actually need in your diet and making sure that you're getting that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the way to break that down, so we've been talking kind of a little bit already about, this idea of variety, and that's kind of addressing this issue of micronutrients and how get these, very particular nutrients into your diet to make sure you don't, wind up with scurvy or something.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this bigger issue of macronutrients, which I guess we also touched on a little bit, with talking about, a ketogenic diet kind of thing or whatever. But that's just kind of the general idea of making sure you're getting enough energy, right? And there's, this is kind of where a lot of debate in nutrition is these days, because like a lot of the micronutrients, even though there's still, lots of studies coming out about like whether this particular micronutrient is as important, or whether you need, 800 milligrams a day or a gram a day or whatever. But generally, like if people are eating a diet that has a fair amount of variety of these kind of plant foods, like you were talking about, you're probably getting enough of what you need to make sure that you can, generally function. But there's, what seems to be kind of more controversial right now is at this macronutrient level. So you have like, these low carb diets, you have people that are critical of that kind of thing. Um, is that like, do you have a dog in that fight, or do you want to weigh in on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think there is this question of even how do you, as the person who's trying to figure out what makes sense for your life, how do you handle some of the controversies and the debate that's going on at this higher level? Because there is an important issue. You're already bringing this up that even certain scientific studies that are valid for a certain statistical population, you may not be part of that statistic. So it's important to figure out what actually makes sense for you. So there's a whole practice, I believe, of wanting to experiment and continually experiment, because not only are you different from everybody else, but you are also changing and evolving over time. So the diet that's working for you perfectly right now may not be the same if your lifestyle changes, and just even from aging. And then
Right.
there's a way of thinking about how do you bring in some of these wider debates that are happening in the culture into your own personal experimentation. And I know you
Sure.
had some really interesting thoughts about, for example, even the debates about carbs and sugar.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was listening just in the last couple of months to a podcast with Stefan Guillenet, who is one of the most prominent critics of Gary Taubes, who is, well known as the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case Against Sugar, Why We Get Fat, and these kind of things. He's one of the most prominent authors out there in the low carb camp. And I think what's interesting to me there is kind of this meta point that you're bringing up about how to even think about these issues. And for a lot of people, maybe the way that they're eating for them already is kind of generally working for them, so they don't necessarily have a huge stake in it at the moment at this point in their lives. But if you have like a chronic illness, or you need to eat a particular way in order to feel your best and to be able to perform optimally, I think it can be really helpful to really, when you're looking into these things, to make sure that you're actually looking at it from a range of perspectives. So even looking at multiple sides of these big debates on these kind of issues that are very complex and controversial. And so for me, you know, when I was researching all of this nutrition stuff, when it became really important for my health, I did, you know, I read a lot of Gary Taubes's books and I found them really interesting. But I also, you know, I read some of his critics. You know, another major critic of his is a guy named T. Colin Campbell, who's the author of the China Study, which at the time that it came out was the largest study on nutrition that had been published. And it was a study that it was like a long-term study that he did in China on a very large sample of people. And in his study, you know, he concluded that carbohydrates weren't really that big of an issue, and he thought that protein was really kind of more of an issue that was causing some of these chronic health issues that you know, we're becoming more concerned about, and particularly animal protein. So he advocated a more kind of plant-based, whole food kind of diet, and, you know, decreasing processed foods and things like that. But what was interesting to me, he wrote another very short book called The Low Carb Fraud. So he's very explicit in his opposition to the general low carb way of eating. And, you know, he had an appendix in there where he actually explicitly talked about and criticized Gary Taubes. But, you know, even in that book, you know, he acknowledged, he's like, well, most Americans probably would benefit from eating significantly, you know, or from significantly reducing their carbohydrate intake in their diet. So it's like when you have a debate where there's one side that's very extreme, taking the extreme position, and the other side is saying, well, they have a point, they're just taking it too far. You know, that kind of tells you something.
That there is a point.
Yeah. And it's the same with Stephen Guyanet's criticisms of Gary Taubes. You know, he says similar things as well. He just, you know, thinks that, you know, the worries about carbs are somewhat overblown, and, you know, and maybe, you know, eating more fat like the ketogenic diet advocates is not necessarily the best thing for everybody, which is probably true. And, you know, and so I read, you know, some of those books, and I read, you know, a book called The Good Gut by Stanford University researchers Justin and Erica Sonnenberg, they're pioneers in the field of studying the microbiome, your gut bacteria. And so they advocate, you know, they think that most people should be eating a lot more fiber than we generally do. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is, with these kinds of very complex issues, it's good to look at this range of perspectives and figure out the points from across this range that you think are valid, and figure out a way to incorporate them and integrate them into a strategy that works for you given your particular context, right? So that's what, you know, I did, and I tried to, you know, like increase my fiber, increase, you know, my unprocessed plant intake, but also move towards like a lower carb, more ketogenic way of eating. And that worked really well for me. But again, like you say, this is something that there is a wide range of possibilities here, and that is going to be different for different people in different situations and at different stages of their life. So again, like, I think what we want to stress here, especially for nutrition, is the importance of experimenting and kind of continual experimentation, and making sure you're kind of fine tuning what works best for you over, you know, across your life.
I love that. And the one thing I would want to add there too is, I think we want to experiment with practices, and we also want to experiment with tools. I think this is even, just to tie this back to our 21st century Renaissance Human Project, this is one of the fascinating things about the era that we're living in, is that there are all these exciting emerging technologies that can help us measure some of these different protocols and regimens. So, for example, when you were bringing up the idea of the microbiome, I know one of the tools I'm fascinated to start looking at are these tools that allow you to measure your own individual microbiome, because one of the interesting things about that phenomenon is that everyone's microbiome is different, and it also can change even perhaps rapidly depending on the diet that you're eating. Yes. So being able to have these tools that allow us to experiment, get feedback, and then be able to even modify the practices that we're experimenting with.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, is there anything else you want to add on nutrition, or do you want to move on to the next component?
Yeah, let's move on and let's talk about movement.
Okay, yeah, so movement is something I know you have been a yoga coach, so that's something that you have thought a lot about and have a lot of experience with. So why don't you go ahead and start us off on that and tell us about your practice?
Yeah, so it's true. I've been certified in yoga, Pilates. I've also recently gotten into practicing Tai Chi and some Kung Fu exercises. But I wanted to mention, we were talking about what are our personal practices. Right now, the personal practice that I've been experimenting with that I find works really well for me is this idea of, in popular culture, it's sometimes even referred to as the 7-minute workout. But this is an idea of, it's also often referred to as minimum effective dose workout. And I guess everybody can Google 7-minute workout, although honestly, I will tell you, really, it's more like a 10-minute workout, because ideally there's a minute of warm ups, a 7-minute high intensity workout, and then 2 minutes of stretching. But I find, even for me personally, on days when I am just completely overwhelmed, feel that I have so much going on, I can't make it to the gym, I can't commit to doing a full hour or even a half an hour of a practice, or even on the other end of the spectrum, on days when I'm just feeling sluggish and tired, I can always do 10 minutes. I can make 10 minutes fit into my schedule. And so that's just become part of my routine now. Literally, I get up in the morning, I use the bathroom, and I hit the mat. I do my 10-minute workout every day. And I can commit to that, to doing that every single day. And then if I can, later in the day, go to a yoga class, go to a Pilates studio. Sometimes I even just want to take my bike out and go for a ride or go for a walk. If I can go to a Tai Chi or Kung Fu class, I can add and incorporate all these other ways of moving into my day. But at least I know I've gotten my 10 minutes in at the beginning of the day.
Yeah. And I do something kind of similar, just as far as the basic fitness routine goes. I do like about a 10-minute, just high intensity training workout. And I actually, just for an example of that, if people want to check something out, we can put like a link in the show notes to a YouTube video that I kind of use and follow and vary a little bit. It's called James Steele's body weight routine from a channel called HIT Uni, High Intensity Training University. He just goes through it 10 minutes really quick. He just, a quick workout that's includes push-ups, chin-ups, wall sits, squat, dips, inverted rows, and planks. But I'm sure you can easily find, just with a quick search on YouTube, just a ton of videos on different things, and you can find something that works well for you. And then, I guess there's a couple directions we can take this now. One is just even kind of like more basic than that in terms of just having more movement in your life and not living a sedentary life. Because one thing that we talked about a little bit in our prep chat yesterday when we were discussing this is people sometimes think that exercise is something that they should do for weight loss, and that is actually a really common mistake. But exercise really is not something to do to lose weight, because it really does not substantially increase your the amount of calories you're burning just over your base metabolic rate. And then over time, even if you are really increasing your physical activity levels significantly, your body will actually adapt to that and kind of reset to your base metabolic rate anyway. So that said, I don't want to minimize the importance of exercise for a couple of reasons. First of all, because these actually aren't totally independent variables, and studies have shown that people who work out more actually tend to start eating better, because they don't want to just, if they put all that effort into working out, like there's a bit of a psychological thing where they're like, oh, I don't want to totally blow that now by like eating a box of donuts or whatever. Although some people will do the opposite, and they'll use the like, well, I did my workout, I could justify that donut now, right? Um, but that aside, there are also plenty of studies showing the dangers of living a really sedentary lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So exercise is really important, just not directly for the purpose of losing weight. Um, and so,
So
yeah, go ahead.
I would say, so I guess this gets to what really ought to be the goal of your exercise practice or your movement practice. So I really wanted to share here something that I've learned from my favorite teacher, Leslie Kaminoff, and I brought the
Right.
book to show. So this is Yoga Anatomy by Leslie Kaminoff and his wonderful co-author, Amy Matthews. And they get into this idea of the goal of a movement practice ought to be for what we've been calling adaptability, and why this is so important to think about when you're thinking about movement. So I even wanted to share. So I definitely recommended this book, Yoga Anatomy. And if you get it and start exploring, you'll notice that the beginning of the book, they really go in depth into the anatomy of breath. And so they begin even by talking about why looking at the breath is so important. And so they say, breathing has the dual nature of being both voluntary and autonomic, which is why the breath illuminates the eternal inquiry about what we can control or change and what we cannot. We all face this personal yet universal inquiry at some point if we desire to evolve.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. And one thing to even say about this, so Leslie points out that a common mistake that even a lot of yogis make is that they get trapped into one habitual breath pattern. So if you go to a yoga class, there is a particular type of breathing technique called ujjayi that's very frequently taught because it is very effective for doing yoga exercise asana practice. But this is a breath where it's a deep breath where you're inhaling through the nose and then slowly exhaling out the nose as well with a very slow, steady exhale. And
Okay.
if you go to a yoga class, you'll learn this technique and you will be encouraged to practice it. And it is a very great technique to practice if you are doing yoga poses and you're trying to do this exercise where you're trying to get yourself into these interesting poses and do this very energizing practice, but
Mhm.
it's not a breath technique that you want to practice all the time. So for example, if you're just lying down sleeping or resting, you don't want to be doing this breath practice because it's actually not optimal for the metabolic demands of just resting. So Leslie always makes this point that there's no such thing as one right way of breathing. It's
Right.
about finding the breath that is appropriate for the metabolic demands of what you are doing at the time. And so it's all about this ability to adapt.
Okay. So he's saying that the breath is interesting because it's this combination of the voluntary and the involuntary. And what he's saying is that by kind of automatizing this one particular way of breathing, they're actually making it too involuntary, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that okay? Yeah, that's
Well,
interesting. And it,
there's 2 points here really. So there is this one point that just that what often happens where these yogis go wrong is they learn this one breath practice and then it
mhm,
becomes an unconscious habitual
right.
practice.
They
But
get
he
stuck
actually
in a
has
rut.
they get stuck in the rut, and he actually has a really great quote about this too. He says, and it's not just about breathing. This is about sort of all sorts of movement patterns that we get stuck in. But he
Hmm.
says, habitual tension accumulates over a lifetime of operating our muscular pulleys and fulcrums against the constant pull of gravity, and the constant modulations of our breathing patterns is invoked as a way of regulating our internal emotional landscape. These postural and breath habits operate mostly unconsciously unless some intentional change is introduced into the system by a practice like yoga. This is why we often refer to yoga as a controlled stress experience. And so here they're talking about yoga as your exercise practice, but really you can do this, I think, in yoga or any kind of intentional exercise practice, that the whole point is to make conscious what has otherwise become just an unconscious habit or pattern in your way of moving or breathing. So that what exercise allows you to do is to become more conscious and intentional and purposefully practice, so that you can perhaps have greater flexibility, greater strength, greater endurance, so that you can adapt to a variety of circumstances and contexts.
Okay, yeah. So by, practicing like this one particular posture or movement over and over without introducing more variation into their practice, they're becoming, better adapted to that one particular movement or range of movements, but actually limiting their adaptability to the broader range that is actually more helpful for a different range of situations. Okay. Yeah, and I think you mentioned these different areas that you actually are wanting to work on: the stability and strength, the flexibility and the endurance, and the adaptability. So those are kind of like the core areas in this component of movement that we want to develop for our general physical fitness.
Mm-hmm. Right, these ideas of strength, endurance, stability, and flexibility. But what I think is interesting is the whole point of this is for adaptability, that it precisely allows you to be able to adapt to the different contexts, conditions, and circumstances that will happen in your life.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess just to kind of take that back to my experience a little bit, with at different parts of your life and dealing with different health issues and things, you might have to adapt to, even your exercise routine to different things. So actually, and when my health originally collapsed, one of the first symptoms was that, I was at the time I had a personal trainer and I was going to the gym, and, normally you work out and then you come back the next time and you should be able to do more, right? You should be able to increase your weight or your reps or whatever. And I was actually getting worse every time. And in retrospect, I learned is because, one of the symptoms of my health issues was I was having thyroid problems, and then that can cause problems with the way that your muscles, respond to, oxygen, and so that, instead of rebuilding after you tear them down, they're not able to do that, and you're not able to recover. So I had to, focus on getting those issues dealt with first before I could, address these other issues of, being able to do that kind of strength training again. And so just in the meantime, like I've, like I said, tried to increase my general movement and not be as sedentary. So just through things like being aware of walking. And so you mentioned kind of with the nutrition, the kinds of tools and health tracking technologies that we have. So even just like using a step counter or something, right? Which can have, there can be issues around that in different situations. But, in that situation for me, it was definitely very helpful. But, now that I've recovered more, I was able to start doing a more strength training practice again, which we got into with like the high intensity training, 7-minute workout kind of thing. And, and now I'm to the point where I'm trying to like go even beyond that and find a really good, more advanced kind of workout to do. I haven't explored yoga as much, which is maybe something I should look into because, it sounds really philosophically interesting from that book you were reading from.
But I think approach definitely is.
Yeah. I think just kind of the broader point that I would make there, though, is just I think it's important to find something that works for you in your situation, both not in terms of the quality of the workout or the quantity of the workout that you're actually exerting whatever muscular strength and doing to improve over time, but also the quality. So kind of related to the nutrition thing with the eating to live versus living to eat. It's working out to live versus living to move, moving to live versus living to move, say. So I think it's important to find something that is enjoyable and improves your quality of life, as well as, maybe contributing to your quantity of life in the long run. So for me, like I've tried different things. Like I tried doing CrossFit for a while, and there were things about that I really liked, that were engaging and helpful, I thought. But there are other things that were maybe not as good for me where I am now. So, one of the things that I would recommend that I've heard other people talk about, is maybe just like even think about, the kinds of physical activities that you enjoyed when you were a kid. Like I loved playing like on the playground, swinging on the monkey bars and stuff like that. So one of the things that I've been interested in looking more into is maybe like a gymnastic practice, like actually um, doing some sort of gymnastic program as a way to address these issues of stability and flexibility and strength and endurance and adaptability. Did you want to add something there?
One thing I wanted to add was even just to take it back to, I think we're already seeing some of these themes and principles that are emerging in this conversation. And one is this idea of variety. So, again, here too, just having this variety of movement. Another one of the things that Leslie and Amy love to say, they have this idea that healthy movement is well distributed movement. And so, this idea that one of the ways to be unhealthy is even to repetitively strain or work one body part or one, let's say, way of moving. It's actually interesting because some of the things that we've observed over time now is that even people who we might think of as being quote unquote healthy, like traditional athletes, we're calling this the athlete episode. But there are certain athletic practices where, for example, if you're doing the same repetitive motion again and again, like golfers, for example, do this, right? The way you would do a golf swing, or if you're playing baseball, the way you would swing a bat, that it's important to then also introduce a kind of counterbalancing workout so that you actually are doing a very full body workout, that you're getting a variety of movements into your life. Right. This idea that you don't want to just be taxing the same body part or doing the same repetitive motion again and again. Yeah. And I love this concept of that healthy movement is well distributed movement, so that there is this integration again of different body parts and different systems all coming together to support whatever it is that you're trying to do.
Yeah, some of those repetitive motion injuries are even so well known for particular types of sports that they're even named for that, like tennis elbow or whatever, right? Yep. Yeah, so that's a good point too. Yeah, so do you want to go ahead and move into that third component?
Yes, so let's talk about recovery. So this is the one that I think is even most interesting. And so I work now very much as a high performance coach, coaching people one-on-one. I think I've mentioned before that I've studied life coaching and high performance coaching, creativity coaching. But one of the most interesting, important, and counterintuitive things that I've learned about high performance is that if you are someone who wants to perform at a very high level consistently and over time, it is very important to actively prioritize rest.
Yeah. And that's something that's very difficult for a lot of, really driven high performers to do, because you can feel like, especially, probably we're going to talk about one of the most, or maybe probably the most important component of this is sleep. And a lot of high performers just feel like sleeping is a waste of time. Like the less sleep you can get by on, the better, right? Because then that leaves you more time for more important things. So what's wrong with that?
I was going to say, I know before we were talking about how you hate the phrase everything in moderation. Well, one of the common catchphrases in the culture that I absolutely hate is this phrase that you can sleep when you're dead. Because in a very important respect, sleep and death are exact opposites. Death is all about disintegration. It is how the body disintegrates, where sleep is all about recovery. It's how we actually integrate both physically and, interestingly, even mentally. We might start to get into this too, that what happens during the brain during sleep to increase your mental capacity and performance. But sleep is such an important component of how you are able to live a high performance life. Where I see people go wrong all the time, exactly what you're saying, these people who have great goals and they are driven, but what happens? They push themselves, they push, and then they crash and burn out. And they get into this really awful, vicious cycle of push, crash, and burnout instead of adapting a practice that would allow them to consistently be able to perform at their best at a high level. And perhaps the most critical element of being able to be highly active and a high performer is you have to get your sleep. You
Yeah.
have to get your recovery.
For sure. Yeah, I can kind of understand both sides of that. 'Cause, to go back to my own experience, my
Mm-hmm.
when my health collapsed, the major symptom was sleep problems. And for a long time, the best diagnosis I could get was idiopathic hypersomnia, which just means, I slept way too much and they didn't know why.
Uh-huh.
And, the sleep study I had done showed I was spending less than half as much of my sleep cycle in deep stage 4 and REM sleep. So, recovery as a normal adult. And it was, very erratic and interrupted. So I would basically have to sleep more than twice as long as a regular adult to get the same amount of rest. So I was spending, 16 to 18 hours a day in bed for years, and which is really debilitating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when I finally got diagnosed with Lyme disease and started treating that and began to recover,
The
I
last thing you
like on the
wanted to do was sleep. I get
exactly on the one hand, I
it.
can kind of understand the people who are like, oh, I can sleep when I'm dead because it's like I've already slept enough for one lifetime. But on
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, I have this, it gave me this really deep appreciation for how important sleep is because, like you were saying, just for physical and mental recovery, if you're not getting good sleep consistently over a long period of time, it takes a huge toll on your ability to function both physically and mentally. And I,
Mm-hmm.
experienced that in about as extreme a form as you can. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, I definitely, like if somebody could come up with a way to give us the same amount of recovery in less time, I think that would be great. I would be all for that.
Mm-hmm.
But as it is, like that recovery is so important and so crucial that, even if it takes 8 or 9 hours a day to get that amount of recovery, that is absolutely necessary. And that is something that we definitely need to actively prioritize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one point to make here, just to tie this back into the idea of the 21st century Renaissance Human Project, one of the things that we were talking about, even in our first episode, exploring this idea, was how now in the 21st century, one of the things that I think is great about evolving technology is that more people are able to live self directed lives and schedules. We're able to do our work on our own time. But one of the things about that is that it's easy then to say, well, who cares about sleep? I don't have to live dictated by the alarm clock, but I don't, have to then worry about my sleep, when this is the exact opposite, that we need now, I think, to be even more conscious and intentional about prioritizing our sleep, and about it really, it's about prioritizing recovery. So I totally hear you that what's really necessary is the ability to recover. And maybe someday scientists will discover ways that we can recover in less than 8 hours. But given what we know now, the 8 hours is still, the 7 to 8 hours is what is recommended for most people. But again,
Yeah.
here there's 2 points that I want to say here. One, there are, again, interesting tools that are now being developed to help us measure our sleep, because it's not just that you spend 7 or 8 hours lying in the bed. It's that you're actually going through these different cycles of sleep and getting the deep sleep and deep recovery. So there are all these new and emerging tools that help us measure that. And then there are also practices that we can insert into the day that can help us recover as well, and exploring what some of those are
Yeah.
to help maximize this recovery
So
aspect of high
before,
performance.
yeah, let's get into those. But before I just want to comment on a couple of things that you said there. So
Oh
I
yeah.
definitely agree that the increased freedom and control over our schedules comes with this increased responsibility to make sure that we're actually prioritizing the things that help us function at an optimal level. Um, And then, yeah, I definitely agree about how helpful a lot of these new tools can be as well. And some of them, they're still relatively primitive. Like I think most of the commercially available sleep tracking kind of tools and apps are mostly just using kind of how much you're moving around during the night as sort of a rough proxy for how deep of sleep that you're getting. And that's good as far as it goes. It's better than nothing, and it's a good first step. Um, and hopefully, now that those technologies have begun to be implemented, that the more sophisticated and tools that scientists have in the lab, for measuring your sleep, will soon make it into commercial products where we can be much more precise about how we are adapting that. And then I actually do think it's not out of the realm of possibility that some of these tools will ultimately be developed to actually be able to enhance our sleep in ways that will maybe make it so that our recovery time will be shortened. Like I think they actually have started doing studies in labs where they can manipulate your brainwave patterns to simulate the restful sleep and things like that. So that kind of thing will be super cool.
I
but
totally agree.
but yeah, but apart from sleep, like how else can we recover during the day after, we've expended our mental and physical energy? What other kinds of practices are there that we can utilize?
Yes, so I did want to make sure to mention just some other recovery practices that you can use throughout the day. One of the great things about these is they allow us to take a break, often get recovery in the middle of the day so that we can then approach the second part of the day with more energy because we've gone through recovery. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these practices can even also help us get better sleep at the end of the day.
Right.
But so even things like saunas and salt baths have been shown to be very helpful for people to help them recover more. Things like
So,
massage or even a gentle yoga class. So there's all different types of ways to practice yoga. There are definitely more intense ways to practice yoga, but there are also gentle restorative yoga practices or classes that you could explore that would help with recovery. But one of the most basic, and I think it's wonderful that it's becoming very popular now in our culture, ways to achieve this recovery, even during the middle of the day, is to start developing a meditation practice. And this is
yes.
definitely something else that has become incredibly important in my life. I am and have been a meditation teacher, and I definitely love introducing, encouraging, and helping people incorporate meditation into their daily lives so that you can have this recovery that allows you to perform at your best.
Right. Yeah. And meditation is something that I kind of discovered and got into a few years ago, as part of my recovery from my health issues as well. And it's been extremely helpful for me as well. I just, this is something we could probably do a whole episode on, just
Yes.
exploring the different facets and aspects and different types of meditation, because
Exactly.
there's so much interesting stuff going on there. But I guess just to stick with what's relevant to the topic at hand here. Um, yeah, I think it definitely certain types of meditation, kind of like you were saying, with certain types of yoga that are more geared towards this goal of recovery. And I think it's probably because those types of yoga are very meditative types of practices,
Exactly.
right? Um, so maybe you can tell us a little more about that, how these meditative practices can contribute to recovery.
Yeah, well, one of the things I actually thought we would do is I thought maybe I could just lead everybody through a very simple 1 minute meditation. But
Mhm.
one of the points to make is that the practice that I'm going to lead you through is a breathing meditation. And one of the interesting things about that is that by even focusing on the breath and trying perhaps to slow the breath, but interestingly, even just bringing your attention to the breath can start to change the breathing pattern in a way that encourages more rest and relaxation.
Right. So
And
sorry, I think we're getting a bit of background noise here, so I just maybe want to wait until that's done before we actually start the meditation. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and guide us through a quick 1 minute meditation, Joya?
sounds excellent. So we're going to take this minute to pause. So wherever you are, I want you to bring your attention to your feet. Feel your feet firmly pressing into the floor, the ground underneath you. Then bring your attention to your spine. Reach through the spine, reach through the top of the crown of the head. So you're reaching up toward the sky. But let your shoulders relax and glide down your back. Let your jaw relax. And for this practice, it is recommended to smile. So now you'll bring your attention to your breath. Don't try to change or manipulate the breath, but just notice the sensation, how it feels as it enters your body, how it feels as you exhale. And together we'll do a deep breath together, a nice long deep inhale, and an even longer exhale. And then come back to attention. That is your quick 1-minute meditation. How does that feel?
That felt good. I liked releasing the tension from my jaw because I actually do tend to hold a lot of tension there for some reason. Been working
Lots
on
of
it.
people do. Shoulders and jaw, it's the biggest ones.
Okay. Glad it's not just me.
But now hopefully we're all recovered to take this show to the end. I think
Yeah.
we're getting toward the end here.
So let's kind of tie it back together because we've kind of analyzed out these three major components of physical fitness, of nutrition and movement and recovery. But one thing that we really want to remember and emphasize is that ultimately this is all part of a whole. This is all integrated. So you really can't, like, all of these are interconnected. And we talked a little bit about how movement and nutrition are related. Obviously nutrition is very important for physical exercise, but also recovery is very closely interrelated with these, because if you're not moving and you're not getting good nutrition, that really can affect your ability to sleep and recover, and vice versa. And then of course there are some of these other common threads that have been kind of emerging through this discussion. So what are some of these threads that you've picked up on, Joia?
One of the most important ones I've seen is even just this idea that there's not some one platonic ideal, that all of this is contextual. It's contextual to you as an individual, and it changes over time. And I guess that maybe gets into the next one. We wanted to talk about this theme that's emerged of experimentation, why it's important to experiment with both practices and tools over time so that you find what is working best for you.
Right. And yeah, also the importance of variety. And I think it is really important to remember that there's not one right way to do this for everybody.
Exactly.
And there's not even necessarily one right way for a particular person to do this, because like you said, it can change over time. And even at a particular time for a particular person, there can be
a range,
a range of or just different ways of accomplishing the same goals. So yeah, so we definitely don't want to be sort of dogmatic about this or rigid. And for me, another really important point is just, and kind of tying back to the experimentation, is really approaching this with a scientific mindset. Just kind of looking forward to this other aspect of being a 21st century Renaissance person, of being a scientist, that we'll be discussing in a few weeks. You really want to focus on measuring how these different practices affect these overarching goals of adaptability and longevity and vitality. Whether that's using these different kinds of tools that you talked about, or just being familiar with the actual scientific literature on some of these issues.
Exactly. And one thing I'd say is we can even tie this back, I think, to our previous episode, which was all about the entrepreneur. I would suggest you can even approach this as an entrepreneur, the way we discussed that role in a broad sense in our last episode, that you want to start up a project that is mission driven to optimizing your life and your fitness, and to be results oriented about the practices and the tools that you're experimenting with.
Yeah, I like that. Approaching your own life in terms of your physical health and fitness as an enterprise.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, great. Okay, so
I think it's time for recommended resources.
yeah, let's move into our recommended resources. You want to go first on that?
Yeah, so I already talked about the book that I recommended, Yoga Anatomy by Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. And the other main resource I wanted to recommend today is actually an app. So if you're interested in meditation and exploring really a variety of styles and practices in meditation, I recommend this app called Insight Timer.
Okay.
They have subscriptions that you can pay for, but many of them I find are incredibly reasonable. And one of the best things is they offer a bunch of free meditation. So here's an ability to try out a variety of different meditation techniques and practices and do it all from your phone.
Great. Yeah, I'm actually going to be looking for a new meditation app in the next month or two here, so I'll definitely have to check that one out. And also, I
Insight
still need
Timer.
to, yeah, Insight Timer, and I still need to pick up that Yoga Anatomy as well. Sounds really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I have a couple of recommendations as well, as usual. One of them is a book. This is Go Wild by John J. Rady and Richard Manning.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just one of the best books I've read, just kind of on all around fitness. And so they have chapters on uh, food and nutrition, and on movement, and on rest and sleep, and on awareness. And and they tie it in both from kind of like an evolutionary perspective, but also the more recent research on these topics, and on kind of like the neurological underpinnings of all of these things and how it all fits together. So definitely really enjoyed this book and got a lot out of it. So highly recommend that for people who want to dig more into these topics. That's Go Wild by John Rady and Richard Manning. And then the other recommendation I had today is actually a podcast I think I've referenced a couple times on this show before. It's called Human OS Radio, which the website is just humanos.me/podcast. And then they have, a blog and stuff there where they have articles and things. But they just have on their podcast, they have a variety of guests, usually researchers in these different health related areas. So, some of the recent episodes, is the paleo diet, good or bad for aging, with Michael Rose, who's a really, prominent sleep research, or sorry, aging researcher. He did kind of the really seminal work on fruit flies and rodents and things.
Mm-hmm.
How studying pre-industrial societies can inform us about how to be healthy, research on smartphones and sleep with Professor Gene Duffy from Harvard, introduction to heart rate variability with Phyllis Stein, and then they had a follow-up with Stephan Guyenet after his debate with Gary Taubes on the Joe Rogan Experience. So that's just some of the recent episodes they've done. And then I actually saw, if you follow them on SoundCloud, they actually have kind of sub-channels if you're just interested in following a particular topic that they talk about. So they have ketones OS, or diet OS, or physical activity OS, probably sleep OS. So it's just a really good resource I found for kind of staying up to date with a lot of the current research on these health-related topics.
Yeah, I've dipped my toes into that podcast, but it looks like there's such a wonderful wealth of information and research and resources and expertise there. I can't wait to explore it more.
Yeah, great. Hope you enjoy it.
Yeah.
All right, so next week we are going to talk about the financier, how the kind of financial aspect of your life and your personal finances.
Mm-hmm. So this episode has been about your personal health and fitness, and now we're going to transition into your personal finances and that aspect of your life. But let's tell everybody about the weekly challenge for this week. We actually have a two-part challenge for
and this is a
week
new one.
all
So
about, yes,
the last few episodes we've done the same one, but now this is a new challenge. So
a new week, a new challenge. So do you want to tell people what the two parts are?
Sure. So first part, if you have a moment right after you listen to this, you can go to our Facebook page and tell us about one new nutrition, movement, or recovery practice that you want to commit to experimenting with this week. And then the second part is by the end of the week, go back to the page and tell us what your results were or what steps you've taken to implement it.
Exactly. So we really want to encourage all of you to be experimental and to be results oriented about these practices. So the first part, get it done earlier in the week. And then for the second part, just make sure you get it in by, 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
By next Wednesday.
Yep. And for everybody who successfully completes both parts, you will be eligible to be the winner in this week's drawing, and whoever wins this week will get a deep coaching session with me. And so I can coach you about any three of these practices or really any aspect of productivity that might help you live a more high performance life.
That sounds awesome. Am I eligible?
Maybe. You've got to get both of your entries in on time.
All right. We'll see. Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you, Joia. It was a fun discussion with you again.
Oh, thank you, Ash. It's been great. Can't wait to see what we talk about next week.
Okay, talk to you all next week. Yeah. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Seeing Eye to Eye. You can find and subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, or via RSS. If you found value in this show, we'd love for you to give us a review on iTunes or tell a friend who might be interested.
Don't forget, you can also join the Seeing Eye to Eye podcast Facebook group to participate in the weekly challenge, ask questions, and add to our growing conversation. See you next time!